to the degree that you want something is the degree you're afraid of not having.
Yeah.
God, I wish I started when I was younger. I go, well, yeah, but you didn't. So shut the fuck up and let's
Right.
keep going.
Right.
Like you can't.
Nobody changes until they change their energy. And when you change your energy, you change your life. Because it's not till then that it's really real.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is way worse than I thought. It's like, oh yeah, it's way, way worse than you thought.
Yeah.
But luckily, there's more to you than you think.
Steven Kotler, my man, it's good to see you again, brother.
Good to see you.
Especially on the eve of reading your amazing book. And how I want to start this podcast is actually starting by reading a bit from the end of your book, because I think this really sets the tone. You write, what impossible challenges would you tackle if you knew you could be 500% more productive, if you could be 600% more creative, if you could cut learning times in half? That's exactly what the tools and the techniques in this book can provide, which means that's exactly what's available to you, to each and every one of us. What you choose to do with this information, well, that's entirely up to you. So go fucking get them. I added fucking, but go fucking get them, Tiger. And hell yeah, man. I mean, that's it. Like I think that's what we're all pursuing in a certain way. And your book does a great job of kind of making this from something that's abstract to something that's concrete. And that's one of the things I love about it.
Thank you so much. I think it's the book everybody's wanted me to write for like 10 to 15 years. People wanted me to write it right after my first book about flow, Wasted Jesus. And I remember it like so clearly when the publishers came to me and I was like, the science is not here. It took 20 years for the science to sort of catch up to the idea of this.
Yeah. And, as you say, science is always on a continuum. And I think, that's one of the challenges that we see even now is people think of science as something that's fixed and finite and dead. Well, it never is. It's always evolving. Our understanding is always growing. And that discourse of information, exploration, discovery is absolutely necessary to keep it alive. It's like the respiration of science.
Yeah, I like to say that science is usually directionally accurate and sometimes factually accurate. And right. And when it's factually accurate, it's not that the facts themselves are wrong. It's that they exist at a particular scale, right? A certain level of information. For example, neuroscience, where I study and I work, the upper edge of neuroscience right now is kind of the population level of neurons and communications between population. Those are neurons, and people are starting to work on that. And cognitive neuroscience is starting to take those network dynamics and apply it to behavior. But that's sort of the edge of where we are right now. So everything, we're true up to there. Everything beyond that is a giant mystery.
Right. I mean, at a certain point, the concept of quantum physics, the concept of quantum computing, these were abstractions, kind of mysterious and not that well understood, but they're becoming more and more practical. We're going to have a quantum computer at some point that's going to change ones and zeros forever.
Go to Rigetti.com right now. It's Rigetti.com is one of the people working on a quantum computer, and you can download Forest, which is their open API. It's a quantum interface for anybody, and you can run programs. I think it's a 32 qubit computer right now, maybe more, but they're like 1.5 million programs been run. So and that's not full strength. I know what you're talking about, but that's still like an interface to the quantum world that's available to everyone right now, which is kind of amazing. But I also a lot of the stuff that I'm writing about in this book is, sort of evolving exactly along, those kind of trajectories, which is why, it's so much, and so much has been done the past 5 to 10 years. So finally we're like, oh, wow, there's a complete map that all of human performance is designed to work together. Look at that, right? And this is right. But that's, again, like systems level stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like that, I'm sure there's certain metaphysical possibilities of what the human organism might become capable of as we were able to adapt. As you said, from one of those extreme sports analogies, what was impossible in the morning suddenly becomes possible in the afternoon. And then it's like, oh shit, like there's a whole new world that's available. But a lot of what you're talking about is the accessible level that we have now and have always had, which is this flow state. And it's one of the things you're most known for. So let's just start there and start to give people, even if people don't have, I think we all have some rough idea, but you go really deep into the nature of flow state. And that's what's accounting for what I teased everybody with, these 500% improvements in productivity and mental capability, increases in strength and awareness, all the physical adaptations that come from it, creativity adaptations. All of that's available by just getting ourselves in this right framework that also has a lot of biological markers that are easily, measured if you have the right equipment.
So, thank you. It's a great place to start. Flow is it's defined scientifically as an optimal state of performance where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, it refers to any of those moments of kind of rapt attention and total absorption. You get so focused on what you're doing, so lost in the task at hand, everything else just seems to disappear. Action and awareness will start to merge. Your sense of self will get really quiet, maybe disappear completely. Time dilates, a fancy way of saying it, passes strangely. So sometimes it'll slow down. You get a freeze frame effect when you've been in a car crash. More frequently, it'll speed up, and 5 hours will go by in like 5 minutes. And throughout all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. Those were the numbers you were alluding to in the beginning are some of what has been measured in flow on various aspects of performance, and what the state does to performance. So it's a huge kind of step function worth of change in a lot of different stuff. And we've all had this experience of flow. It's universal. It shows up in everyone. And we can all get way more of it is sort of one of the points of the book.
And I think sometimes we conflate the activity itself and the pleasure of an activity with the flow state, which is actually driving a lot of the pleasure. For example, one of the things that's been actually triggering flow state for me is I picked up a new sport, and the sport's called pickleball. And it's like a combination of tennis and ping pong, so it's like tennis on a small court with a racket that's somewhere between a ping pong paddle and a stringed racket, right? And I have some buddies that I'm real competitive with, and we go out there and, time evaporates. And it's not only that the time evaporates, but we're just so engaged in it. We're playing, we're having fun, we're innovating, we're thinking about the creativity of our shots, completely immersed in that activity. And so part of me is like, man, I just love pickleball. But really, yeah, I'm sure I like pickleball. I'm sure I like hitting the ball over the net and, scrambling for other things. But what probably I really love is it's actually allowing me to access flow state, in that point. So really what a lot of the pleasure is not hitting backhands and forehands. It's that activity is driving me into this optimal neurochemical cocktail that is, as you say in the book, one of the absolute most pleasurable things the human organism can experience. It's like being on 6 drugs at once.
That is absolutely correct. Yeah. So I mean, you're totally right. It's an interesting question. So I think I covered this in Art of the Impossible, but I'm not sure if I did. Positive psychologists now talk about sort of 3 levels of happiness that are available to all humans on Earth. And level 1 is just hedonic pleasure, right? How are you right here, right now in this moment? And it turns out there's not a whole lot you can do. Like Dan Harris was sort of right. You can be 10% happier. And a lot of that, we have emotional set points that are sort of set up by early childhood, by genetics and early childhood experience that sort of determine the bandwidth of our life. And we like feel everything between the low and the high point, but they don't really extend out. There are a little few ways to stretch them, but it's not super flexible. The next level up is what is termed either engagement or enjoyment. And it's literally a high flow lifestyle. And it could be literally, you could be, doesn't matter what your job is, you could have an amateur pickleball life going on, yeah. Right? And that counts. So like I live in South Lake Tahoe, and there are tons of people who live all around me who work construction jobs over the summer, which are kind of flowy jobs because you're working with your hands, it's engaging. But they can ski all winter, right? So or hunt all winter, or both, right? That's really common. That's the second best. And the highest is when you take the thing that produces the most flow for you and can couple it to purpose.
Mm.
So something outside yourself that's greater than yourself that produces a tremendous amount of flow, which is sort of why the book starts there and talks about going in that direction. Um, but that's the best we get to feel on the planet. You sort of poked at a much more complicated question, which is like, how much do we enjoy shit without the flow, right? Like,
Right.
is it, and it's interesting because it's known. So in athletics, for example, flow is often what happens when we automatize, we learn a bunch of skills well enough that we can do them almost automatically, and they start to come together. As you said, with pickleball, you're innovating, you're creating new shots, and right, that's that flow. You've laid down the stage. Amplify a lot of. I have no idea how I wound my way into this. But the point being, it's a little peculiar. Like, we don't, flow's defined by 6 core psychological characteristics, one of which is autotelic experience. It's exactly what we're talking about, an end in itself. It means once an experience starts producing flow, we'll go extraordinarily far out of our way to get more of it. So where is what is flow and what is the activity is an open question, but it is possible you can win, for example, gold medals in world championships without flow. It doesn't happen very often. Flow is always a portion of the learning process itself, but in the actual competition, you can do it, and you can talk to people who have had those kinds of experiences, and everybody says the same thing. It's possible once, but you'll never want to repeat it.
Right.
It's just right. You can produce that much energy and you can work that hard, but without flow, sort of amping up strength, deadening pain, doing all that stuff on the physical side, it's really unpleasant to perform at that level.
That's a really interesting point as well. And I think for me, what makes it really clear is, so I can go out and play pickleball with a beginner, and whatever the criteria is to create the flow when I'm playing pickleball competitively with people, where we're like at the edge, at our performance edge, where we're really challenged.
By the way, I'm very proud of you because you keep talking about pickleball with a straight face as if this was a thing, right?
Yeah, it's a thing.
We're pickleball. It's really good. Like, you're holding it together. Every time you say it, I'm like, he's going to lose it this time. He's going to like pickleball.
Yep. So, well, if I'm out there just playing with somebody who's a beginner, I don't get anywhere near it. And it's not even that pleasurable. If someone who I know isn't that good is like, hey, you want to go out and play pickleball? I'm like, yeah, sure. I'll do that. Like, I would scratch your back. Like, I'll do that, for you in a way. Like, yeah, sure, we'll go out. It'll be a nice experience for you. But it doesn't drive that same kind of enjoyment that I have. And also, one of the characteristics of this is, after a highly competitive game, I'm like lit up. My brain is fired up. Sometimes I even have trouble falling asleep. It's like it alters my biology and neurochemistry to a point that's lasting, which I think is another interesting thing as well, where that doesn't happen when I'm just out there playing. So it really makes me aware that it's not only the activity, but it's the conditions within that activity.
Well, you're pointing at, we can talk, flow states have triggers, right? One of the reasons we know we can get more of it is there are preconditions that lead to more flow. There are 22 of them, that are 12 that are individual, 10 that are group flow. So you can get into a shared collective version of a flow state. You and I can get into a flow state talking. That's known as interpersonal flow. In fact, the most common flow state in the world, though most people don't recognize it, is actually, pre-COVID, it was middle managers in a work environment having conversations. That was the most common, like getting lost in that. People talking about a work problem, and a couple hours go by and they don't even notice. Most common flow state people have found, or one of them. But these preconditions, or the interpersonal flow, is just one-on-one, then goes next level up as group flow. This is a fourth quarter comeback in football, right? The whole team comes together. Or great, if you've ever seen improv theater or seen a live band where the band comes together, the music just soars. That's group flow in action. Been part of a great brainstorming session where the ideas are flying around the room. That's group flow. And then you can get it at huge scale, right? Which a political rally or a rock concert, that's communitas. It's group flow at scale. When there's 100,000 people and you've merged with the crowd and the band and the music, and right. So it goes up and down in terms of the scale of the impact. When you're playing pickleball with really good competitive friends, that's group flow. And you sort of were poking at several of group flow's triggers, like familiarity. It's really and equal level of skills, right? And you need equal level of skills for the obvious reason that if you take an absolute beginner to the court, they're having fun and they're challenged, but your attention isn't there. It's not challenging enough for you, et cetera, et cetera. And so but 6 different things you just talked about are foundational group flow triggers. And now we're starting to understand the neurobiology underneath them. And by the way, when I say there are 12 individual and 10 group, this is all we found so far. There's probably way more, but that's what we know so far. And there's very distinct kind of neurobiology underneath the triggers. We know what they're doing in the brain that's driving us into flow.
Yeah, and it's the same with conversations as well. And in these conversations, because you mentioned that about middle managers, if I'm having a conversation with someone who's really intellectually stimulating and the ideas are novel, I mean, that conversation I'll have rapt attention. But if I'm talking to somebody where I'm explaining something that's just rote for me, or the discourse isn't that engaging, my mind will be running a background operating system. It's like part of my CPU is just kind of figuring something else out on the side because this isn't challenging me to bring me forward. Same with a book I have to read that isn't really challenging or expanding my awareness. I'll just kind of go through it, blah, 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 thinking about something. Oh, fuck, I didn't even read these last pages because I'm not into it. But a book that's like challenging or a conversation that's stimulating, that will drive me into that flow state. And that's where, the magic is. That's where I don't even know how long I was doing it. I'm just there. And that's one of the things that I love about podcasts is the stakes are high. There's a lot of people listening. I'm talking to really, incredibly stimulating people. And so I'm fucking there, so I love the art of podcasting. And this is kind of where it blends into, instead of pickleball, which is kind of just a tangential activity, which gives me a nice hit of flow, but has completely unrelated to my purpose. Podcasting has become co-opted as a part of my purpose. So it's in some ways like the highest form, and at least the most productive form of flow. The most productive form.
It's worth a couple things that are worth pointing out. So flow has, we talked about a fairly big impact on creativity. And this is all aspects of creativity: problem identification, problem solving, pattern matching, all the subsets that go into creativity are sort of surrounded by flow. And you'll see, depending on whose numbers you're going by, a 400 to 700% boost in creativity. It's a huge upswelling. But Teresa Amabile at Harvard figured out that heightened creativity, you sort of got at that a little bit earlier, it can outlast a flow state by a day sometimes too. So flow itself, 90-minute experience. There's no fixed time limit. And there's an altruism triggered flow state known as helper's high. It was discovered by Alan Lukes, who founded Big Brothers Big Sister. And it supposedly lasts a couple of days. So, and that may have to do with more oxytocin and some of those social chemicals that you'll get from that kind of experience. Besides the point, average flow state is about 90 minutes, right? But the creativity is a couple days, which is really amazing. And the other thing that is worth noting, flow is essentially kind of focus. It's a specific kind of focusing skill. Certain things are happening in the brain, but it's like training the brain to do anything. So the more flow you have, generally, the more flow you have. In other words, I would guess, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, that since you've been getting way more flow on the pickleball court, I'll bet you're finding flow in the podcast is easier to drop into and a little deeper, I would guess.
Yeah, and that's where flow has a universality to it. And I think this is a cool thing to explore, is that perhaps you haven't come up with your massively transformative purpose, which is one of the things that you talk about, or you don't have your high, hard goals. And I want to go into all of those because I think that's a really important thing to follow through on. These things that relate to your purpose or your, acts of service, you're not doing those. But even the simple act of finding flow anywhere is going to help you. So even if it is pickleball.
Yeah, no, I mean, by the way, during COVID, because flow, the humans, let's back up a couple big ideas that are worth getting out up front, which is when we talk about peak performance, what the research really clearly shows is it's nothing more than getting your biology to work for you rather than against you. And not a new idea, right? William James, 100 years ago, in the first psychology textbook ever, says the great thing then in all education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. So, right, like not a new idea. The only thing that's new is now we understand that there's a specific set of tools and there's an order to the process and it's designed to work in sequence. And that is accessible to everybody else, but that's all besides the point. Flow itself was adapted for us to deal with crisis situations. Lots of, oh shit, something's going down. We need to perform at our best. Let's take care of it. That's where it sort of came from originally, from an evolutionary perspective. We can go more into that, but that's just a quick idea. The point being, COVID, when COVID started, this is people in crisis. It turns out, a lot of the stuff that we work on was really perfect for it. And one of the very first things we were telling people to do during COVID is make sure to double down on what was known as your primary flow activity, which is literally whatever that thing was that you did as a kid that dropped you right into flow. Maybe it was read comic books or learn to dance hip hop or martial arts or surf or skateboard or play tennis or draw or paint or spelling bee. Take your drum major, take your pick, whatever it was. And as a rule, and this, as we become adults, as we become responsible, what's the first thing that goes right out the window is that thing that gave us so much flow. And literally, especially during crisis situations, the first thing you want to do to react to a crisis is reboot your primary flow activity. Because especially during a crisis, it's going to be really hard to get out of your head. And the best way to do it is to find something that you absolutely love to do. So that's one of the first things we were training people to do at the beginning of COVID was, okay, stay socially distanced, stay away from other people, but figure out whatever that thing was and find a version of it that you can keep doing now.
Yeah. Is it, as you talk about this, and you have a great quote about flow, which is like basically how this gets done from a biological perspective. I think what you say is that oxygen is to breathing what flow is to, these forms of innovation when pressed with a great challenge. And is that why potentially when it's aligned with your purpose, because when you have a strong purpose, a purpose that you're passionate about, a purpose that is meaningful not only to you, but meaningful to the greater, self or the greater whole, then it almost is putting it's raising the stakes in general. So if you have a really strong purpose, it seems like you're almost mimicking some of the environment that a crisis would provide, except not on an acute level, but at an extended kind of long-term level.
Let me give you a little bit of a big picture thing. First of all, and the place you got to sort of start with this question is, what does flow actually amplify? And it amplifies a huge suite of stuff: productivity, motivation, creativity, and innovation. It accelerates learning. It amplifies empathy, ecological awareness, our ability to perceive the natural world. It increases strength, stamina, fast twitch muscle response, and deadens pain. And if you know anything about science, when somebody presents you a laundry list of, hey, and by the way, these are like productivity, McKinsey, that you said one of the numbers you threw out was the 500% boost in productivity. That's at the end of the book. That comes from a 10-year study conducted by the McKinsey consultancy, where they went around the world asking top executives how much more productive are they in flow. Now, it's a self-reported thing, so grain of salt there, if you will. But they asked a lot of people over a decade. On average, it was 500% more productive in flow. That's like you go to work on Monday, spend Monday to flow state, you take Tuesday through Friday off, you're getting as much done, right, as everybody else in that 1 day a week of flow. 2 days a week, you're 1,000% more productive than the competition. So, like, to put it in context, it's a big boost. But if you've got any kind of science brain, you got to be like, well, why would one state of consciousness amplify all this stuff? Like, what the hell's going on? And it's a really good question. The answer is that flow is how humans have been shaped by evolution to perform at their best. You got to ask yourself, well, what shapes evolution? And it's scarcity of resources. And when resources are scarce, you have two options. You can fight over dwindling resources, or you can flee to avoid becoming somebody else's resources, or you can get innovative, get creative, get cooperative, and make new resources. Those are the options. So everything that flow amplifies is everything we need to either fight or freeze or flee, or get creative, get cooperative, band together, make new resources, right? Go explore, find more resources, that sort of thing. That's the whole toolkit. And purpose, in a sense, is getting more resources for not just you, but also your whole tribe. And the way that's sort of the way it right, we're built. So once, and this is sort of known. So the way to cultivate purpose and the way it works in the book. Okay, now we said that. Let me back up and introduce a second idea, and then we'll get to purpose. The first thing to know is that flow triggers we talked about. All the flow trigger is flow happens when the law of retention is right in the right here, right now, in the present moments. That's what all the triggers do. They drive focus, they drive attention into the present moment. And they do it one of three ways. They push neurochemicals, dopamine or norepinephrine, into our system. They do a lot of different things. They're pleasure chemicals. Dopamine is the same substance produced by cocaine. So when somebody snorts cocaine, the most addictive substance on earth, all that happens is the brain releases dopamine. Norepinephrine, internal version of speed, right? Ritalin, meth, same, right? Same cocktail. These are incredible, energizing, exciting, focusing chemicals. And where would the flow triggers lower cognitive load, which basically is the shit you're trying to think about at any one time. If I lower cognitive load, I free up extra energy for attention. You can pay more attention to the present. So that's how the flow triggers work. So that was a side note. Now, back to purpose. What Art of Impossible really is about is an entire system, and that system always starts with motivation. And when you want to play with motivation, obviously the first place you've got to start is external motivation. You need food. You're going to need basic survival level resources. This is what Maslow figured out with the bottom of the pyramid. You got to sort of, even though it's not actually a pyramid, if you talk to Scott Barry Kaufman, who just wrote Transcendence, he'll tell you that Maslow's pyramid was more of a metaphor than an actual thing. But he was right about safety and security. And what the research shows is we need to be able to take care of basic safety and security needs with a little bit of cash left over, really, to get into the peak performance game. You can do it from less than that, but it's hard to do because the anxiety produced by sort of living right at the edge of your means. You can do it, but once basic needs are met, you've done with your external motivators, money, sex, fame, those kinds of things. Those are still powerful drivers, but they're not primary anymore. And what the biology says is once you're at that point, intrinsic motivators take over. And there are 5 major big ones: curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And they're actually designed to work in a sequence and be built in a sequence. So curiosity is where all of it starts. And the thing you got to also know here, that the last bit that I have to tell you before this gets filled in, is that what's the big deal about an intrinsic motivator? The answer is, when it comes to peak performance, we don't have a hell of a lot to work with. We have our focus and attention. We have our actions. And if we can put our focus and attention on the same thing over and over and just repeat our actions, we get habits, which is actions automatized and sort of effortless and automatically. But that's about all we have to work with. And the action, like when you're learning a thing, you still have to do the thing. It's still going to require the energy it takes. So there's not a whole lot you can do with that. Where the big lever is focus. And the reason internal motivators matter so much, curiosity, passion, purpose, all this shit, you get focus for free. Think about how hard it is to pay attention to something you're not into versus how easy it is to pay attention to something you're into. You told me already, when you're paying attention to something you're not into, part of your brain's solving a different problem. When you're on a podcast with somebody who's interesting, you're paying attention to them. It happens automatically, right? Passion is the next step. All passion is the intersection of multiple curiosities. Why? A little bit of curiosity is some focus, but it's not enough over time to really sustain you. But if you can find a way to figure out where your curiosities intersect, that's passion. Once you have passion, you can then attach it to a cause greater than yourself. That's how you find purpose. And if we can send your listeners to passionrecipe.com, www.passionrecipe.com. It's the very opening of the book. It's how to turn curiosity into passion into purpose. So many people felt that was so kind of important when they read, and they were like, oh my God, this is so useful. And we've used it for so many tens of thousands of people at this point. We're just giving it away. So it's out there for everybody if you want to know how to do this. And yeah, once you have purpose, I know what my purpose is in the world, what do you need next? You need the autonomy, freedom to pursue your purpose. And once you have autonomy or the freedom to pursue your purpose, you need mastery, the skills to pursue that purpose well. And that's the stack of your big 5 intrinsic motivators. And each is designed to flow into the next. And you asked, what do you get? So this is going to loop everything back. Curiosity is a little bit of a flow trigger. It's not a huge one, but it's a little bit of one. Mm-hmm. And when you're curious, you get a little bit of norepinephrine and a little bit of dopamine. When you can put a bunch of curiosities together, you're getting a lot of norepinephrine and a lot of dopamine. This is passion. Think about how much when you first met your wife, you couldn't, like when you're falling in love, romantic love, right? That's passion. That's a lot of norepinephrine and dopamine. The problem then isn't like, I can't not pay attention to you. It's how do I get you the fuck out of my mind, right? Like I can't stop thinking about you. You're everywhere. So that's what happens when you add in purpose. You get all that norepinephrine and dopamine, and then you start getting pro-social chemicals to other people. You're no longer just providing resources for yourself, passion, but now it's for your family, your tribe, your society, purpose. And now you get all the pro-social neurochemicals added in, oxytocin, endorphins, and anandamide. These are all bigger feel-good chemicals. That's why purpose works so well as a motivator, and so forth into autonomy and mastery. You're basically turning up the feel-good neurochemical juice each step along the way. So even though purpose seems very high-minded and altruistic, first of all, from a peak performance standpoint, it's totally selfish because you get more out of yourself, right? And then from
and it's more pleasurable.
Well, that's what I mean. From a feel-good, hedonic, internal, like if you're actually measuring pleasure chemicals, right? If you weren't terming it altruism, if you were just measuring pleasure chemicals, no, purpose is more fun. It's a better high.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've experienced a phenomenon that's happened, and it's really come online particularly since meeting and marrying my wife. And so I'll explain. I think part of the, as you said, there's extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And I had like a dual engine jet that was motivating me. I had my extrinsic motivations and my intrinsic motivations. I've always known I had something important to contribute to the world, ideas, thoughts, the ways that I could use language and communicate, and the ways that I could lead. All of these different things were a part of my motivation from the beginning. But there was also a healthy grip of extrinsic motivation that was largely wrapped up in mate attraction. And even in my previous relationship, it was a polyamorous relationship. So mate attraction was, finding the next paramour, or even finding something else, particularly, another romantic partner, was a big part of my extrinsic motivation, because I started to knock down during that period. I created Onnit. I wrote a best-selling book. I was doing a lot of the things that were extrinsically motivating. I had the wealth. I had the influence. I had all of the different things that were driving me earlier. So what was really left was mate attraction. That's another thing. The more I put out there in the world, the more likely I am to attract a high quality mate. And so I had that. Well, then I get married to Vailana, and all of a sudden mate attraction, that's like, I just put a big old check in that box. And it was like the last bastion of true extrinsic motivation was crossed off the list. And now I'm looking out and I'm like, oh, wow, all I have left is intrinsic motivation, really. I mean, of course, that's a hyperbole to a certain degree. Of course, there's always going to be some small extrinsic motivation that remains driven by the ego and driven by certain things. But I've gone from a 2-engine jet for the most part to pretty much a 1-engine jet. And I've found myself at certain points lacking in that motivation. And I've realized I've got to go back and really double down on my purpose to drive enough fuel into my intrinsic motivation.
Hold up. You're right, sort of. But so the way the book the way the book is structured, right? You want to start. It starts with motivation, and motivation. There's the extrinsic stuff, and then there's the intrinsic stack. Then you've got your 3 tiers of goal setting. Your massively transforming your purpose, high, hard goals, and clear goals. We'll come back to that in a second. Mm-hmm. then you go into grit. And one of the big grit skills is the grit to confront your fear. And there's this order to the sequence, but once you get that far along, which is sort of where you are, that's when your fear becomes your best friend. That's when your fear becomes another motivator that you actually tap into, when you're that right. And I always say this, everybody I know who's ever kind of tackled impossible challenges, right? Who the book is really for, people who are going after really high, hard goals in a sense. They're all running away from something, first of all, just as fast as they're running towards something, right? And that's because that double engine, as you pointed out, is really useful. And so something's usually chasing people who get really far a little bit, and they kind of let it. And they like running towards something. But I think at a certain level, you have to start, like these days for me, I will, when I write a book, I've written Art Impossible, I think is my 12th book, 13th book, somewhere in there. And there's 2 more that are sitting in drawers that the world will never see. So it's like 15 or 16 or something like that, right? I've done it a lot, but for the past 4 or 5 books, often I'll say, okay, what is the scariest kind of book? Like what haven't I written? What's really hard? And sure, there's an idea I want to communicate in the book. That's the communication challenge. And there's this style challenge. But for example, Bold was a book I wrote with Peter Diamandis, and it's a business book. It's a straight up business book. And I have never seen first of all, I'm so not a business guy and so not a business writer, right? That like, even in of itself, the fact that an old punk rocker like me gets to write a business book like that is pretty funny. But on top of that, most business books suck, right? They're just terrible. They're really badly written. And so Bold, the challenge was, can I write a business book that doesn't suck? And that was a terrifying thought, right? Like I was doing this way back when I wrote West to Jesus, which was so early on, but it was probably the first major book anybody had written about the neurobiology of so-called mystical experience, right? What's going on in the brain when we're having so-called peak experiences. And the time this was so cutting edge, and I was using surfing as a metaphor. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, well, so I've got surfing and mysticism and neuroscience. And if this goes wrong, I'm going to be like the poor man's Richard Bach. It'll be like Jonathan Livingston Seagull for surfers kind of thing. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to come back from that one. But that level of fear is really good because it keeps you focused. And I think that's also like, yes, I agree with you about go back, reboot your purpose, all that other stuff. But it's also, maybe slightly bigger challenges.
Yeah, a bigger, scarier goal. And I think that's a part of it, because at a certain point you've fulfilled at least a good part. And that's why when your purpose is a little bit abstract, as I said, I was describing my purpose to you and it was highly abstract. I'm here to share ideas, to bring a convergence of my own, psychedelic inspired spirituality with philosophy and entrepreneurship, and this idea that you can achieve balance by reaching for the extreme. There's these specific things, but it's just, they're all very kind of general. And I actually made that even more specific even when I was talking there. But I've kind of achieved a good quotient of that. And so, and it's been great. That was incredibly scary and seemingly impossible, at least lowercase impossible hard for me to do at a certain point. Cause I didn't have anything. I didn't have a platform. I didn't have a podcast. I'd never written a book. Never started a company. And then all of a sudden I started knocking these things off.
And you'd never done a psychedelic, which was what was really brave of you. You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah. And so, but now I think part of this purpose reboot for me is to really invest in a new high hard goal that's fucking terrifying, something that's scary.
Well, so let's clarify a couple things, just because the terminology is a little confusing. There are 3 levels of goal setting that it appears that humans need. There are other ways to divide it up, but 3 is the minimum. It sounds like you need a mission level, what Peter and I dubbed a massively transformative purpose, or a mission level goal for your life, right? And that's what you were talking about. That's a mission level goal for your life. And I think those things don't change, right? Mine, I have 3 things that I sort of came to do. They haven't changed. They're still what I steer by and filter by. but your high heart goals is the next level down. And these are, let's say your mission is to write books that change the world. Your high heart goals is, I want to get a degree in creative writing. I want to study journalism for 5 years so I can learn how to do that. I want to write a book on cooking. I want to write a book on jujitsu. I want to write a, take your pick. Those are your high heart goals. They're usually, depending on who you are, 1 to 5 year projects tends to be. And I think it's good to set, everybody's got different time horizons, and different times in your life you can see kind of farther out, right? The sort of hungrier you've been, the shorter your time horizons tend to be as a general rule. But I like to set 3-year goals. For my own life, I found, even with my companies, after 3 years, so much has changed in the world that it's not useful for me to try to predict beyond that. So like, I'll set higher goals and then you need your clear goals. What's the shit you're going to do today to advance towards your high hard goals? And what really needs to start, when we talk about setting harder goals, you're talking about upping the level on your high hard goals. You don't really, the challenge level of today you always want to be stretching right to the edge of your skill set, right? Pushing, you want to stretch, but not snap. And that's the pickleball example. The most important flow trigger, the challenge skills ratio. Flow shows up. We pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. You want to stretch, but not snap, right? And that where that sweet spot is, the so-called flow channel, it's different. If you're shyer, if you're meeker, it's a little harder because it's always right outside your comfort zone. But for folks like yourself, Aubrey, the problem often with what you go after today is you'll take on challenges that are like 100% greater than your skill set, 200% just for the thrill of it at this point, right? And you still have to chunk it down so that what you're dealing with today is just outside your skill set. Otherwise, you're producing too much anxiety and you're going to end up blocking peak performance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think differentiating, between those kind of mission level things, which are always there and can be a little bit abstract, and then reducing them to something that's a little more definite, a little more concrete with your high hard goals, and then reducing that even more to your daily to-do list, what you're going to do this week, what you're going to do this month, how you're going to go about accomplishing that.
And by the way, let's talk about a couple things about the day. Clear goals for the two lives is process goals, right? They're not outcome goals. Your daily to-do list can't say today I will win the Nobel Peace Prize. Like it doesn't write. It's got to be today I'm going to write 500 words in my new book, or that's something that you're like, okay, I can do this. And whether those words suck or they're great doesn't matter. The point is it goes on the list and you do it that way, right? So it's really that it's worth knowing that those are sort of process goals. Where your high hard goals, those could be more outcome goals in that I want to write a book. I would never set a high hard goal that is, I want to write a book that is I want to write this book and demand that it does this in the world. I might say one of my high hard goals is to write a #1 New York Times bestseller, but I would never tag it to a specific book.
Right.
Because I can't. I want all my goals to be within I want them to be crazy stretches, but I want them to be within my power. And what a book does in the world, there's certainly marketing and PR, and there's all that stuff that you can do. But ultimately, the book is going to do its own thing in the world. And that's, you know what I mean? Peter and I just launched Futures Faster Than You Think. Last year, we were in Fox News, going on Fox Morning Show. And God, there's news out of China about this new strange disease. That was what they were updating people about right before we came on air. And I looked at Peter and I was like, I think we might have a problem, Peter. I think this virus thing might be around for a little while.
Yeah. I think that's really important because we're not responsible for how the external world responds to what we're doing. So there was an interesting study that you put in, because this is a really important topic. Interestingly, there was a study that you put in about lumberjacks, and lumberjacks were given, basically they were told, look, just go out, do your best, cut as many trees down as you can.
Hold on. Let me tell people there's one thing so this is Gary Latham and John Locke. They're the fathers of goal setting theory. And they're coming on the scene in the 1950s. And up to that point, there was this overwhelming idea in business that sounds so strange now when you say it out loud, but it's just funny that happy workers are productive workers. So don't give anybody a quota because it's just going to make them unhappy. Don't tell the lumberjack go out and fell 100 trees this week. They'll just tell him to go out and work hard. And that was right. That's what matters. And Locke and Latham come along and they're like, I don't know. Like, I think the machinery works a little bit differently than you think it does. And we were just then starting to sort of understand it. So they literally start giving two groups of lumberjacks. One group gets quotas and the other don't. And the quota people are coming back and they're producing 2, 3, 4, like they were beating the quotas, and the other lumberjacks weren't even coming close. And what they ended up finding, they redid it with lumberjacks. Then they went into they were like, okay, maybe it's just lumberjacks. So they firemen and then business, everybody they could possibly find, setting a high, hard goal around something is enough to produce an 11 to 25% boost in motivation. That's freaking crazy. That's if an 8-hour day is your baseline, right? That's like getting 2 free hours of work at the high end, simply for context, for having the right goal around the thing you were going to do, right? You're going to probably do whatever it is that you're working on. You're probably going to sooner or later have to do it anyways. So if you have the right kind of goal built around whatever it is that you're working on, you get a 20% boost in. Are you kidding? That is so much focus for free. That is so much work done for less effort. That's an amazing thing. And by the way, that's what happens when you get your biology to work for you rather than against you. That's the whole point of all this, right? It's not work harder, it's work smarter, and the system starts to work for you, and you go farther faster.
It's interesting because I've definitely failed at this, because I've also understood going back to what you were talking about earlier, I was best friends with Bodie Miller for a long time. We're still very close. And I really learned from him, as an athlete that I was intimately, close with and had the, purview to his whole psyche and his whole understanding. He never thought about winning or losing because that depended on a bunch of different factors. Were his skis right for the snow conditions? Was his start position correct in giving him the optimal opportunity? Because the way that the snow, and this year's skier, the way that the snow has been carved and what position you're in is crucial. Sure. You don't want to go number 1 through 10 and you don't want to go number 30 through 40. You got to be in that sweet spot. You got to have so he was just like, I'm going to ski the mountain as good as I can possibly ski it. And that's all he cared about. And of course he won multiple world championships, gold medal, etc. But he always focused on process. And I think in general, that's very important. But I think I've overused that philosophy and almost never set myself with a small, clear goal quota of, I should write this many words. I've kind of applied that to my whole life, saying like, you know what, just always do your best. And, always, be aware and all. Yeah. And I've really never set.
Oh, the clear goals.
Clear goals for me.
Yeah. So clear goals are a flow trigger. Right. And when goals the focus shouldn't even be on the goals, it should be on the clarity. Right. And while high, hard goals amp up motivation, clear goals actually drive flow in the moment because they tell you where to put your attention and for how long and exactly what to do. So you don't ever have to wonder. That automatically lowers cognitive load. So for example, we teach people to end your day by creating a clear goals list for the next day. And you always want to start with your hardest task and the one that is the biggest win. And, we tell people to try to devote 90 minutes to uninterrupted concentration to it. That's a specific number. Complete concentration is a flow trigger. And 90 minutes is how long we are biologically designed to focus. REM sleep's 90 minutes. So are our waking cycles. So 90 minutes is a really good window your brain is designed to focus for that long. I tell people to see if you can start your day with your hardest task, first thing on your clear goals list, and it's the biggest win for the day. So for me, that's always my writing session, and you referenced 500 words a day. That's when I'm starting a book, because 500 words is 350 I can do with my eyes closed. 500 words is one idea, and you have to connect it to the next idea. And that transition, right? That's the bitch. And so if I can get to right, that. So, but that's also at the start of a book. The middle of the book, I know more or less a little bit more what I'm doing. So then it's like 800 words a day. And the end of a book, it's 1,200, 1,500 words a day. So it's a moving target depending on the day, but start with your hardest task, go to your easiest. And the thing that's really important here is figure out how many things you can be excellent at it in a day. Try it, run it out. Like try 5 things in your clear goals list. Can you really be excellent at all of them? And when I say it goes on your list, if it's going to take energy, going to the gym, it goes on the list. If you're going to hike the dogs, it goes on the list. If you're going to have a meaningful conversation with your spouse, it goes on the list. Anything that's going to take energy goes onto the list. Figure out how many things you can do in a day and be excellent at it. That's how many things go on the list. And you want all of them pointed. All your clear goals need to be pointed at your high hard goals, which need to be pointed at your massively transformative purpose. And that's how you get the absolute most lift out of your day.
What about accountability for these goals? Because that's when somebody else, in the case of the lumberjack quota, somebody else was setting the goal. They had accountability, or if you're working for somebody else, you have a certain level of accountability. And so what about accountability? Because this is the thing that I also have. Sometimes I'll do that and I'll be like, well, I made this fucking schedule anyways, so I made this list so I can remake this list on the fly, right? So you can it allows me a little bit too much flexibility.
I always say it this way, and this is in the book, and you read right past it because you didn't want to right. You read right past it. But I think there's certain laws of peak performance. And I think the first one is always keep your word. And I don't mean always keep your word to other people. Of course, that's super important, but I mean always keep your word to yourself. And so one of the things we know, if I say it out loud, it's a contract. I've said it to the world. I've said it with myself. It's a done deal. I have to tell this to everybody who works for me. I'm like, you can't come into a meeting with me and tell me you got something, because to me, it's a contract. Like it's the same as if we, got lawyers involved and signed on the dotted line. And that's how I roll. And once you say it out loud, I'm going to hold you accountable to that. And if you don't deliver, I'm going to fire you. Right? I'm really clear on that kind of stuff. I'm like, but I'm really, so when I put it on a to-do list, it's a contract with myself. I've just entered into a contract with myself and I don't let myself out of it. And so if it's on my to-do list, now there are days where, item number 3 on the to-do list turns into a nightmare. You know what I mean? And I didn't see that coming. And, then I'm like, okay, I put in a full day. You know what I mean? I got nothing left in the tank. I will boot this stuff onto the next, I'm not illogical about it, but I will, if I need to stay at work an extra hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours to finish off a list just so I kept my word to myself in a given day, I do. And I think that's where you really start getting super exponential results from that level of, because it's a grit skill. And the thing about grit and pushing yourself harder is there's learning to be tougher, which you have to do by going out and pushing yourself kind of beyond your limits consistently. That's familiar to everybody. And most people, especially if you've ever played a sport, you can do that. But there's a second half to that equation, which is you have to believe you're that gritty. So you have to actually have done it enough times in a row. You can't just go out and I'm going to train grit today by going really hard once. Your brain has to believe that reservoir is real and it's there. So if you do it over and over and over and over again, you keep that word to yourself over and over and over, you start to develop a different level of trust with your own sort of grit skills and fortitude skills. And I think that further amplifies performance. Everything that further amplifies performance is the thing I can't prove. On everything else, up to that point I can prove, but this is where the science ends. I think it further amplifies performance. That's an opinion. Everything else I can give you the science on.
Yeah. I think that's a really important thing to note, because there's certain things that we've all proved to ourselves. And, for me, because I'm using myself as this N of one kind of example here, I've proved to myself that when something or someone really needs me, I'm fucking there. And I know that about myself. When it needs to be done, when I must show up and be at my best, I know I will. Right. And so that's something and I've proven that. And it's not like I was born with that. I've shown that. I've flexed that muscle over and over again. And then it's in the small stuff. It's in those, and I get frustrated with myself about this, in the stuff that I allow myself too much permissibility and flexibility to modulate it, and too much of going back on my word. So in some ways, I haven't built enough trust in myself, which, so if I reduce it to the specific thing I didn't do, oh, well, you said you were going to do yoga today, but you didn't do that. No big deal. If I reduce it to not doing yoga in a day, all right. I mean, that's not that big a deal.
Yeah, it's not the thing that you didn't do, it's the not doing.
Exactly. And that's the thing that will universally be a detractor for my ability to operate at my peak, which is the most important thing in my life. So reframing it that way, it's almost like it anchors it back to a bigger why, an even bigger why.
Yeah, you stop. Once you start to figure out that you're like, oh, wait a minute, it's not the thing, it's the doing of the thing, because I'm training a muscle. It has nothing to do with the yoga, right? Yeah. So I at the end of the book, I have a low grit. So when I can't work out, like for energy days where I'm freaking exhausted, I've got workout on my schedule and I just can't, I'm just so beat, whatever reason, I have a low grit workout exercise, which is 200 push-ups. If I hike my dogs for 20 minutes up the mountain behind my house and do 200 push-ups along the way, I can skate when I have meaning I haven't slept 2 hours. The day is long, and I have a low grit exercise workout that I do because I'm like, if you can't hike up a hill for 20 minutes and do 200 push-ups when you're fucking exhausted, then I shouldn't do half the stuff I do. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I do it not because, man, there's nothing walking uphill for 20 minutes and doing 200 push-ups. It's not going to do anything for my fitness. You know what I mean? But I'm doing it so I just know that when I'm that exhausted, I can do this thing.
Yeah, it's training self-efficacy to a certain degree, and I think that's absolutely vital. There's something I'm going to go to another concept that I thought was really interesting. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez recommended that when you're in something and you're really kind of moving, quit while you're still excited. And my brain just lit up when you talked about this, because it makes a lot of sense. So go explain the philosophy behind that, because I think it's a really cool idea.
Let's give the motivation gets you into the peak performance game. We've been talking about that. And motivation is really, when psychologists use the term, it's they mean grit, they mean goals, they mean intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So that's the motivation suite. Then once you have motivation that gets you into the game, and the goals to tell you a little bit how you get there, and you need the grit because that's what you need when the motivation sort of runs out along the way. The next thing you need is to accelerate learning. You have to keep learning, especially because if you remember that flow shows up when we use our skills to the utmost. So not only do you want to kind of tick everything off on your clear goals list, you want to attack it, right? And sort of push to the edge of your skill set. If you do that, what happens? You keep learning. So you need the learning skills to be able to keep up with the acceleration that's coming along. That allows you to continue to play. And finally, you need creativity, because that allows you how to steer. And especially because the book is about going towards high, hard goals. Those are often things we don't quite know how to get to, right? You can't there's no rule book, there's no playbook. You sort of had a bunch of ideas of what you do, but no real clear idea to get there. You need creativity and innovation is how we steer. And then the last step is, of course, you need a flow to turbo boost the whole process beyond all reasonable expectations. But we're in the creativity portion of this kind of suite of skills that you're talking about. And this is ways to sort of amplify creativity. And this is also a very good flow hack. So when I teach flow for writers, which is the big kind of creative class that I run sometimes, we always use this. This is one of the first things we teach people is stop working when you're most excited. And Garcia Marquez, nobody's quite sure where it came from originally. Hemingway used to do it too. And he used to stop. He got so addicted to it, he would stop writing in the middle of a sentence. And it's a twofold hack. The idea is, we'll come back to the flow portion of it in a second, but when you quit when you're most excited, the next morning when you stop, right? Or when you start, nothing is harder than getting into something, right? That's what's going to require the most grit. So they're making it easier, because if you're quitting while you're most excited, you're going to carry that excitement back with you the next time you jump into a project. And I've used that for years when I write. So I will write 500 words a day, right? But I will try to stop when I'm at a point where like I'm really psyched about sort of like the sentence I'm writing. Right? It doesn't even have to be like the idea. It just has to be like, oh my God, I'm really liking this sentence. And then I'll just sort of stop there, so it'll like linger in my head. The other thing is, this is really sort of key in flow, because flow as a general self-awareness sort of dials down, right? And by the time you're coming back into consciousness, when you sort of note, when you're like, oh, wow, I'm actually really excited, this is really fun, you've actually probably been in flow for a little while. And the neurochemicals, we've been talking about norepinephrine and dopamine, they're at peak concentration. They last about 20 minutes in the brain. That's why TED Talks are 20 minutes long, because our maximum focusing chemicals, they've got, so if I crank it all the way up, that you get about 20 minutes worth of intense focus. You can spread that out longer, various ways, but that's sort of, so by the time you're really noticing you're in flow, you've probably been in there 30, 40 minutes, a little bit, and you may be waning a little bit on, right? So it's like, it's a good way to conserve a little bit of norepinephrine and dopamine for the next day, so you don't exhaust it all also, because you can do that in flow. You can just keep chasing ideas because it's fun, and you'll burn out all your norepinephrine and dopamine. And by that point, usually it sort of gets to be diminishing returns after a little while. Scott Schmidt, early extreme skier, used to say, flow makes me feel like I'm Superman up until the moment I'm not. Right. And I noticed that skiing, like I'll be in flow, and suddenly I am just not in flow. And if I thought I was in really deep in flow and decided to hike up to the peak, I better hope I'm still in flow by the time I get up. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. The that idea of potentially, because this is also, I think, sometimes without understanding the biology of what you were actually doing, we might not understand the necessity for that recycle rate, the ability to recycle and actually pay attention to our biology. And that's where, that kind of restoration, that active restoration, passive restoration, that becomes an important part of this cycle, because we are actually dealing with a high energy output and actual physical chemical reaction that does not have an infinite level of potentiality.
That is absolutely true. This is one of the most, it's sort of at the end of the book, but I don't know the exact numbers. I've probably trained over 100,000 people at this point, and probably the most important thing I've out of all that work is talking to people about the flow cycle, because most people think it's a light switch. You're either in the zone or you're out of the zone, and it's not. It's a 4-stage process, and there's very precise shifts in neurobiology and neurophysiology underneath each stage. And the third stage is the flow cycle itself, but as you pointed out, very energy intensive. Even if it feels great, you're burning a shit ton of energy there. And on the back end, there's a recovery period. And we have discovered, by the way, if you have an active recovery protocol and you double down on your primary flow activities in your life, it's almost impossible to burn out. There are certain situations that can do it, but if burnout is a problem, if you've got an active recovery protocol coupled to regular access to your primary flow activity, it's really prophylactic against burnout. And what an active recovery is, passive recovery is television and a beer, right? That's passive recovery. And TV is actually really bad for recovery because of how it affects our brain waves. It feels like you're recovering and you're not. And alcohol is a disaster when it comes to recovery. Too much sugar really messes with sleep, blah, blah, blah. It really tends to block recovery. Active recovery, restorative yoga, Epsom salt bath, long breath work, long walk in nature, infrared sauna, regular sauna. I'm a big sauna not advocate, because what works for me may not necessarily work for you, but saunas work really, really well for me for active recovery. And I try to do breath work in the sauna. Saunas will automatically lower cortisol, whereas some of the other stuff doesn't do it automatically. I like it for that reason, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have to tell you about saunas.
Mm-hmm. And cold therapy too. I mean,
Cold therapy is another one.
That's one of my favorite tools for sure. And for me, getting my eyes under the water, triggering that mammalian dive reflex, feeling my heart rate start to drop. I mean, that's a key aspect of that to me. That's why I far prefer cold immersion than cryotherapy, even though they have some full body cryos, but a lot of them just go up to the neck. It doesn't quite cut it for me. Like for me, I really need to get to that point where my body is starting to down-regulate all biological activities because it's trying to conserve energy. And when I'm in that state, I pop out of there and I'm, really refreshed. But, really keen to think about, that everything in the human organism is cyclical, and we need that the yin to the yang always in all of these things. And even though while flow can seem restorative to a certain degree, it's also burning fuel.
Oh yeah. And a simple example, I'm a workaholic, right? If it's not ski season or downhill mountain bike season, and even if it is on the days that I'm not, I'll do 17-hour days. You know what I mean? Like I work and I ski, and that's about, you know what I mean? And, but I found I got a 9-week limit, and then I have to go shut it down and be absolutely quiet for 2 days, 9-10 weeks. Cause the work will just start slipping. It's just, I can only push for so hard before I have, even with daily active recovery protocols built in, you know what I mean? Even with the regular active recovery protocols, after 9 to 12 weeks, I got to shut it down for 2 days.
Yeah, it's knowing yourself, and that's going to be different for everybody.
Everybody.
And this is where so much of this is formulaic, but it's also flexible depending on the individual.
By the end of The Art of Impossible, there's a whole bunch of onboarding stuff. You got to line up your intrinsic motivation, all that stuff. But by the end of it, everything that book covers is 6 things to do in a day, 7 things to do in a week. Some of the day stuff that can be 5. A couple of them are 5-minute processes. A couple of them are like your 90 minutes for uninterrupted concentration. You're going to be doing whatever it is you need to be do. That's just, to maximize focus and peak performance kind of thing. That's not a huge bunch of stuff. But as you pointed out, how everybody is going to do it is totally individual.
Yeah.
And it has to be I always, in the book, I open the book with this. Too often in peak performance, what people figure out what works for them. They try to train other people with it, and most of the time it fails for everybody else. And the reason, the way we always talk about it, is personality doesn't scale, biology scales. And the reason is that personality, core aspects of your personality, where are you on the introversion to extroversion scale? How active or inactive are your dopamine receptors, and thus your risk tolerances? These are genetically hardwired and set up by early childhood experience, and yours are going to be very different from mine. So my personality, I found this out early on. My risk tolerances were shaped by, I was a professional journalist. If you don't nearly die once every 3 months as a professional journalist, you're not doing your job. And I was also doing a lot of spending time around action sports athletes. And if they don't die on a nearly month by month basis, they're not doing their job. So this was just normal life to me for a very long time. I didn't realize everybody didn't have those risk tolerance. You know what I mean? I just thought this was just, yeah, of course you would nearly die 2-3 times a year. Of course, that's just what happens, right? And so when I learned a little about flow right after I had sort of written my first book. I'd made the mistake that everybody makes. You learn a little about performance. You want to help your friends, right? And my friends, so I was writing a column for Psychology Today. I had written, some bestsellers on this stuff. They really thought I knew what I was talking about. And I'm telling, I nearly caused a divorce. I put a couple people in the hospital. I nearly got a guy killed. 2 of my friends still haven't spoken to me in 20 years. You know what I mean? I made a mess of it. And that was where that sort of idea started to emerge. Like, wait a minute, personality doesn't scale, biology scales. And because we share enough similar biology, that if you can get down, that's why the neuroscience matters so much, right? Psychology is great, but it's essentially metaphor. When psychologists use a term like mindset, when I say mindset out loud or you say it out loud, most people think we mean attitudes towards life. And when psychologists say it, they mean attitude toward learning, and specifically, they mean specific things in the brain. Psychology is metaphor. Neuroscience is mechanism. And if you can get down to the neuroscience, you can get to the mechanistic level, and then you really have a blueprint to work from.
Yeah. I thought one of the things that I really enjoyed was when you talked about how oftentimes people will list themselves as one thing or another thing. They'll be introverted or extroverted. They'll be playful or serious. And you list like a whole group of 10 of these. And I think it's from Csikszentmihalyi, his research, where he talked about both and.
Yeah.
Right?
So so Mike and I actually have a little bit of a disagreement on this, but it's his work originally, which is that most people are either or. Personalities as general are either or, but creatives are both and. So creatives are extremely introverted at certain times and really, really extroverted at others. They have to be really, really sort of naive. You have to be really naive a little bit to write a book, but you have to be really, really, really sharp and not naive to market. You just need to be conservative, right? You're an artist. You're conserving the tradition of painting. You're still as a painter, but you're also rebelling against it a little bit, so you can be both and. And where I said, Csikszentmihalyi and I have a little bit of a disagreement is he has argued that there's a creative personality type that, and certainly there's work that points to schizotypical people as more creative and more both and. But what I think is true is as people learn to be more creative, one of the things that happens is you start having to take in more perspectives, starting to see things from more sides as you become more creative. And that, I think, starts to train up this both andness. So I always warn people that, like, if you're sort of not trained creativity before and you start doing it and you start becoming more creative, expect more emotions along the way, because that's what both and gives you, right? And it's gonna, so you start to see it, and I've seen it in companies too. When companies are like, oh my God, we gotta work on innovation and creativity. They start up these programs, and employees do get more creative. They also get more emotional.
Yeah. And that's, and I think just having the acceptance for that. So if you are creative and you do go through these swings of emotions, instead of judging yourself for it and saying like, oh my God, I can't believe I was naive here and I was serious, but then I got so playful. And then you start judging because you think you're supposed to be a certain way, but to really be in that creative spirit, is to accept that you're going to be both of these things, and you're going to have the highs and the lows. And that's just the nature of your life.
It's funny because Flow for Writers pre-COVID, we used to do it out live do it like once a year, maybe. Usually it's a digital class once a year. And when I would teach people this very thing, you would watch the relief on people's faces, right?
Yeah, for sure.
One after another, they're like, oh my God, now I understand. This is why I'm going up and down so much. Oh, there's hard wiring for this, and it's actually a superpower, even though it hurts a lot sometimes.
Right.
But it's a liberating piece of information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are some other interesting things that you notated there as well. And talking about creativity, you talked about how a 5-year-old was scoring on genius levels, 4 and 5-year-olds scoring at genius levels of creativity, and then it kind of degrades over time. If you want to go over that, I think that's an interesting concept for us to think about, of what can happen from the conditioning of being in this world that we're in. So
it's interesting. It was a study done by a guy named George Land. He did it with NASA. NASA was like, okay, they were really interested in creativity for obvious reasons, and so he came up with. He was working with one of the people that came up with a test for divergent thinking. So convergent thinking is sort of logical, and it moves in towards an idea, right? You close in. Divergent is wildly disparate, connecting really disparate ideas together. And they created a really simple test for divergent thinking, and they started testing different patient populations. They basically figured out that kids, very, very young kids, test extremely well for divergent thinking, and that atrophies over time. And you start out wildly divergent at around age 5, and by around age 15, 16, it's naturally shrunk down. There are a bunch of different reasons for this, but it's a muscle, basically. That study is sort of erroneous in where it leads you, because your creative skills don't sort of atrophy over time. You're just not using them as much, and most jobs teach us to think convergently, especially at the time they were doing these
and
studies.
Schools
do. But I think that's started to change a lot. But certainly, creativity, we didn't used to think it was trainable. It's very trainable. That we sort of now know. And flow massively amplifies creativity and divergent thinking as well. So those things are super trainable, and you can definitely get more of them. But you have to work on them because, and some of this is just normal, natural brain pruning. It's just how it happens, right? We're born with all kinds of crazy neural connections, and they prune back in the early years of our life.
One of the other things that you talked about that was is immediate feedback, and getting immediate feedback as you're learning in any skill. And you talked about how people's skills in a lot of professions degrade over time, which is counterintuitive. You would think that, your skills would improve the longer you did it. Yeah.
The clearest example is doctors, which unless you're a surgeon or feedback is immediate, most doctors get worse the longer they're out of med school. Because feedback, think about a radiologist. They'll read a radiological screen. Most of them they'll never know if the patient even lives or dies. So they don't know, did I read it right? Did I read it wrong? It's just, they're reading it for a doctor. They're passing it along to the doctor. This is starting to change a little bit because people are starting to realize that feedback is so important. It's a flow trigger. When feedback is immediate, you don't have to wonder, how am I doing, right? Especially because mastery, we all want to be good at the things we do. It's a motivator, and feedback tells us how you're doing. And it also, where and when to put your attention is a big flow trigger. Also very crucial for learning. And when we work with organizations who want to increase the amount of flow in the organization, we always tell them, you can't have quarterly reports or yearly, you know what I mean? That's not immediate feedback. The example I give, one of the examples I talk about in the book is just from my own life in writing. This because editors these days, they don't really edit in the way that I like to have somebody read basically everything I write a couple days after I write it. I like to write it. I like to rewrite it, work it a couple times, and then get some feedback. If I have an editor read a book twice or three times during the course while I'm writing it, an editor with a publishing house, I'm lucky, right? That's, my God, I got a lot of their attention. Normally it's one read, and maybe it's a good, maybe it's a good edit, maybe it's not, depending on who you're working with and where you are. So I had to hire somebody who can, read my stuff twice a week and give me the feedback I need. And it was one of the most amazing thing I ever did for writing. I doubled my output in terms of writing by just having somebody giving me feedback. It was, it was an amazing kind of writing hack for me, and big flow hack. It took flow from before he was on my staff, before I was working with him, flow with writing was probably 40% chance of getting into flow while writing. But once he, and I just worked with him 2 hours on Tuesdays and 2 hours on Fridays. My chances of getting into flow while writing are 60 to 70%. Because I sort of always know where I am. And the other thing is, I also know if I get myself into a shit ton of trouble and really screw it up, I'm not going to go meandering in the desert for weeks on end, because I got a guy coming in twice a week who's going to be like, buddy, you're where the fuck, you're off in tangent land. And it's a huge relief, massive massive improvement. And now, so, I tell people, look, you don't have to hire somebody, find a feedback buddy,
Yeah.
find a partner, find a friend. And again, feedback should be focused on the activity, right? When I work with my editor, I don't want feedback on my life or how I'm managing my really, you know what I mean? And I don't even want him to give me his opinions about certain things in the book. Like I focus it, my things are, is it boring? Is it arrogant? Or is it confusing? And if my writings aren't those three, arrogant meaning I'm using lots of fancy words, and usually that's a sign that I haven't done enough research. Usually, well, the problem is the body is a homeostatic organism. We don't like to burn energy if we don't have to, right? So your body's willing to, if you're writing, it's willing to give you the energy for the writing, but it doesn't want you to oh shit, I got to go back and do more research, right?
Right.
So I'll try to cover up the fact that I'll do this unconsciously. It's not even a conscious thing. It's just an unconscious tell that I've come to recognize when I am using a lot of fancy words or a lot of fancy language or really moving my readers a lot emotionally. I always sort of look at it and I'm like, did you do enough research? That's right. Because I'm covering in a sense, and I'm doing it unconsciously, right? So now, now at this point, my editor, he knows what my tells are, and so I get very precise. This is exactly kind of the feedback I need for performance. Trying to get out of this weird sunlight.
The sunlight that's crashing in. Yeah, I mean, when you really know something, you can reduce it to incredibly simple terms, and when you don't, you try to, kind of show off how much you might know. There's this subtle insecurity that can sometimes be there, or just some lack of efficacy that might be there.
I've got a general rule, and I tell this, to a lot of the folks on my staff. We work with a lot of science people, but I always say, somebody needs a lot of really fancy words to explain something, they're lying.
Yeah.
There are people, you'll meet people in the world who, they speak neuroscience, and every word is a very precise term, blah, blah, blah. It's just like diarrhea of neuroterminology. And I don't know. I work with the best in the world, and all of them can explain this stuff. I mean, right? Yes, if we're having a super technical discussion about a very precise thing that we're doing research on, we might write sentences like that, but we don't ever, when we're talking to each other, that's not how we're, right? It might go in the actual paper that's going to go in Nature or something, but it's never how we talk about it at all. And I always feel like whenever I'm hearing somebody do that to me, I'm being conned. There's something I'm not being told. I speak this language, and I don't see any reason to tell you this. All right. I'm trying to figure out. There we go. All right. This is the side. I need to get blackout curtains in here. I moved about a year ago. I love the new office, but the winter sun for podcasts is a new thing that I'm sort of dealing with. And I'm oh, this is sun drops. I mean, it's a good view, but it's not helping me out my cause.
So one of the things that, that speaks to this is you talk about, one of the things you recommend is to get at least 5 books that make you feel stupid. And it's books that really stretch your mind to a certain extent. But it doesn't mean that the language makes you feel stupid. It's that the concepts are so high level. And you actually list one of the books that I would put in that category for me, and that's James Carse's book on finite and infinite games, right? Very simple language, but the philosophy is at such a high level that it wows me, and it stretches me, and it enhances the way I think about the world. And it's a hard book. I have to read it slow. If I was listening on audiobook, which I'm not, but no way I could put that at 2x speed. No fucking chance. I got to go at 1x, and I got to pay attention and put my food down and listen,
So the 5 books is stupid, which is what you're referring to, is in it's a system for onboarding, right? If you want to accelerate learning, you need a process for knowledge and a process for skills, and they're slightly different. And this is one of the few things in the book that is actually based on something that actually came out of my own experience. But when I was a journalist for years, I worked for over 100 different publications, Time and the New York Times and Wired and Atlantic Monthly, and I would often have to become an expert in the subject to write about it. right? You can, like, you don't go into a neuroscience story for, Wired or something like that. A million people you don't get it wrong, and you don't get any chance to get it wrong, right? If you screwed up the magazines, fact checkers are going to figure it out, and you're never going to work for them again. So, like, it's crucial to get stuff right. And I would often have to learn a really hard subject fairly quickly. And I developed a system for it. And the system starts with what I call the 5 books of stupid, which is just a way, start with the most fun book possible, just to familiar yourself with the language. And it's basically a system that's built on the fact that we have innate pattern recognition systems for brains. And the most important thing about, like, as you're onboarding knowledge is, I always tell people, is a lot of a subject is contained in both the history of the subject and the language of the subject. And so in the beginning, you want to pay attention to specific things, but it's as your brain starts to pick up the language, it'll start connecting the idea. So a lot of people have this thing where they read, and if they don't understand something, they have to stop and they read back, and they go back to the beginning and they get mad. And that's not how we actually naturally learn. So there's a system in there for that. But I agree, there are certain books, like, you want to make it progressively harder, and by the time you're getting to book 4 or 5, those are hard books. And you want them as intentionally hard, and you can't really be mad at yourself for not understanding all of it. You have to trust that your brain is still finding the nuggets that it'll find. There's a whole system in there. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Karsa's book. It's a good book.
That book is a really good book. So as we're wrapping this up, I think one of the, you talk about some 4 stages that are going to lead you to these peak performance states to be mindful of. And I liked that you started the first one with struggle, that you're just in a place where shit is hard.
Well,
because we all find ourselves in that.
This is the biology of the flow cycle. And it, flow's the 3rd stage. It's the best we get to feel on the planet, but it starts with struggle. And struggle is it's easy, by design, is a difficult phase. And it turns out, usually struggle refers to, like, a skills onboarding phase. So, like, when you were learning to play pickleball, right, to first swing that mini racket, whatever, you were like, everything was new and you were just onboarding the skills, right? That's struggle. You're just figuring it out. What we now know is that even when it's like a millisecond, say you're, like, riding out your mountain bike, or you're sitting down to do some work, even if you wanted to get into flow, there's going to always come a moment where you're like, shit, this is going to take more energy than I wanted. You literally, even if it's for a microsecond, you have to trigger the brain's fight response, it appears, to get into flow. We're not certain if there's 100% of the time, but for sure, certain a lot of the time. So even if the struggle phase is only going to last an instant, it's going to be there. And what's so important about this is what I think you alluded to when you started, which is, I think a lot of people, when they start to feel frustration, they think it's a sign that they're moving in the wrong direction. And for a lot of biological reasons, if you want more flow in your life, struggle is actually a sign that you're moving in the right direction. So I often say, on the road to peak performance, a lot of your emotions don't mean what you think they mean, right? Fear, for most people, means stop. Peak performers, it means go. Struggle and frustration, for most people, means I'm doing something wrong. No. On the road to peak performance, it actually means you're doing something right. You're exactly where you want to be. And it's like the both and stuff with creativity earlier. Like, if you understand how the organism works, yes, it still feels like shit, right? Like, frustration doesn't feel any better just because I'm moving in the right direction. It's that, the only difference is, when I'm done working at the end of the day and I come back to meet my wife, like, it used to be, before I knew frustration was a sign that I was moving in the right direction, I'd be really, like, she'd have to deal with pissed off Steven for, you know what I mean? But now I'm like, okay, it feels awful, but I actually know I'm moving in the right direction. So I know that tomorrow this is going to be useful for me, drive me to the place I want to go.
And it's also a way to train that fight response. And you talk about Huberman's kind of research about how that is a highly pleasurable state. And I know this from firsthand experience. There's certain times where I feel like I'm on my heels, and maybe I'm not running, but I'm certainly like lean back, dodging, slipping, you know, kind of like moving back from the work, from the tiger, from the dragon that I know that I need to face. And I'm like, just really on my heels. But as soon as I shift that to a forward leaning stance, and I'm like, you know what? Fuck this. Like, I'm done with this. I'm going straight at it. That moment, it becomes intensely pleasurable. And I'm like, Hoka, hey, let's fucking go. And at the moment I say that, nothing has changed other than my attitude, other than going from my heels to being on my toes with a little half smile on my face. My whole attitude and my whole biology, I'm sure, if you actually hooked it up and measured it, has shifted immensely, just like that.
Yeah, it's courage. It's our favorite feeling. We love, well, you get a little bit of dopamine, and it's direct alignment with long-term goals. It brings up a whole bunch of stuff, and you get energy. There's a lot of life in there. I was noticing, and I was thinking as you were talking, you know, it's early. I've had 7 days on the snow, and I'm a big skier. That's my main sport. And you always have to get used to ski speed. It usually takes 7-8 days until, like, you know, skiing takes place at 40, 50, 60 miles an hour, really. But it takes your brain, even, you know, really good skiers, a bunch of days to realize that, like, oh, I can go that fast safely. And this weekend, it was the first time they opened some territory at the Edmonton Open, and I got to dive in. And you were talking about being on your toes, and it was just one of those runs that I've been sort of sitting back, and I was like, no, fuck it, man, you got to attack. I literally like leaned in, I got on my toes, and just like dove into that first turn, like really, you know, really dove in. And it was right, like suddenly it was right there. And I was like, oh yeah, right. You gotta, like, even me, right? Like, I'm an expert. I've written so many books about this stuff, but even then, in the moment, you got to remind yourself of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and just train that muscle, and every time, you know, and what a great metaphor, because skiing, it literally is on your toes. And actually, interestingly enough, being on your toes is probably a safer way to ski that same hill than trying to be on your heels and be conservative in a lot of ways. It's like you're really meeting the challenge head on.
All the equipment is designed to be driven, right? Like, none of the equipment works if you're not. My boots are great when I stay forward leaning. My skis are great when I stay forward leaning. My equipment is not particularly forgiving when I'm not on top of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And that's the same with the human organism. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure, brother. Thank you so much for doing this. And so people who are curious to take, you know, their own journey with you, where would they go to
theartofimpossible.com is where the book has been living. You can also stevenkotler.com. And as I said, the passion recipe, www.passionrecipe.com is a formula that will teach you how to turn curiosity into passion and passion into purpose, which will get you kind of, you know, going along this path a little bit. And Flow Research Collective, if you're interested in flow training or the science we're doing.
Well, it's great to reconnect with you, brother.
Man, it's been a while, but it's good to see you.
Yeah, I'll hit you up when we're heading to the snow somewhere, and maybe we'll cross paths and get to take.
You know, I'm in Tahoe now. So
yeah,
come on out.
Hell yeah, I love it. Thanks, brother. I'll talk to you soon, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Peace.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for checking out this video. For more like it, please subscribe to my channel, and of course, the Aubrey Marcus podcast with new episodes every single week. And follow me on Instagram @Aubrey Marcus. Thank you so much.